She was the mother of the woman he almost married, elegant, untouchable, and 22 years older than him. He was a single father with calloused hands and a quiet life built carefully from the wreckage of a broken engagement. Nobody who knew either of them would have predicted what happened next. Nobody would have believed that a stuck armchair in a narrow hallway could undo every wall two careful, wounded people had spent years constructing around themselves. But that is exactly what happened, and once it started, neither of them could stop it, even when everything around them said they should. If this story already has you curious, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let's see just how far this story travels. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when Nathan Holloway was standing on the fourth floor of a half-finished commercial building in downtown Hartford, reviewing load-bearing calculations on a set of blueprints that kept threatening to curl shut every time the wind cut through the open framework of what would eventually become the building's eastern facade. His hard hat sat pushed back on his head, a habit his site supervisor had given up correcting years ago, and he had a mechanical pencil tucked behind his ear and a cold cup of coffee sitting on a concrete ledge beside him that he kept meaning to drink but never actually did. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He almost ignored it. The afternoon had already handed him 2 rework orders, a subcontractor dispute about anchor bolt placement, and a voicemail from the city inspector's office that he had not yet worked up the nerve to return. He was not looking for more complications. But something made him pull the phone out anyway. Maybe it was just the particular angle of the October light coming through the steel framing, golden and slanted and slightly melancholy, the way autumn light always seemed to carry a warning inside it. Or maybe it was something simpler. Maybe he was just tired of calculations. He looked at the screen. The name stopped him. Victoria Ashcroft. He stood there for a moment with the phone in his hand, watching the name pulse on the screen through 2 more rings, feeling something complicated move through his chest. Not quite pain, not quite nostalgia, just the particular heaviness of a name that belonged to a chapter of his life he thought he had finished reading. Victoria Ashcroft, CEO of Ashcroft Property Group, one of the largest luxury real estate development companies on the eastern seaboard. 60 properties across 11 states. A woman whose photograph appeared in business journals and architecture magazines with the kind of regularity that suggested she was not simply successful, but had become a category unto herself. Also the mother of Claire Ashcroft, the woman Nathan had planned to marry 4 years ago. He answered on what was probably the last ring before it would have gone to voicemail, and he would always wonder afterward what would have been different if he had been a half-second slower. Nathan. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, measured and clear, carrying that particular quality of someone accustomed to rooms full of people falling quiet when they spoke. "I hope I'm not interrupting something important." "No," he said, which was not entirely true. "I'm on a job site. It's fine. How are you, Victoria?" There was a brief pause. Not awkward exactly, more like she was choosing her words with the kind of care that had probably served her well in boardrooms for 3 decades. "I'm well, thank you. I'm calling because I have a slightly unusual request, and you were the only person I thought to call who might actually understand what I'm asking." He waited. "I have a reception coming up in 3 weeks. Holiday gathering for executives and some of the company's institutional partners. About 60 people in the house. I've been trying to rearrange some of the furniture in the east drawing room to accommodate a larger gathering space, and I've run into a problem that is frankly embarrassing, given that I've been renovating buildings professionally for 30 years. Another pause, and then, unexpectedly, something that was almost a laugh, dry and self-deprecating. "There is an armchair. A very large, very old, very expensive armchair that my late husband purchased in France in 1987, and it absolutely refuses to come through the drawing room doorway. I've had 2 of my staff attempt it. I've consulted 3 diagrams I found on the internet about furniture moving angles. I'm fairly certain at this point that the chair and the doorway are engaged in a personal dispute that predates my ownership of either." Nathan stood on the 4th floor of his half-constructed building, listening to Victoria Ashcroft describe a furniture problem, and felt the completely inappropriate urge to smile. "You want me to come move a chair," he said. "I want you to assess the structural situation and advise on the most efficient solution," she said, with a dignity that was both completely sincere and entirely aware of its own absurdity. You are a structural engineer. I am having a structural problem. He should have said no. He knew, even in the moment, that the reasonable answer was to express polite regret and recommend she call a professional moving company. The history between him and Claire was not ugly. Their engagement had ended by mutual exhaustion more than by dramatic rupture. But it was history. Victoria Ashcroft existed in the part of his life that was finished. Opening that door again, even for something as mundane as furniture rearrangement, invited a kind of complication he had spent 4 years successfully avoiding. "When were you thinking?" he said, eking. He told himself, driving out to the Ashcroft property on Saturday morning, that this was a neighborly errand, a practical matter. He was a structural engineer doing a favor for someone who needed one, and the fact that she happened to be his former fiancé's mother was simply circumstance, the kind of minor coincidence that life in a mid-sized city produced constantly without meaning anything. He had made this argument to himself several times by the time he turned through the iron gates of the Ashcroft property in Wethersfield and got his first look at the house. He had been here before, of course, twice during his engagement to Claire. Once for a family dinner that had been elaborate and slightly formal, and once for a 4th of July gathering that had involved a professional catering company and more people than Nathan had been entirely comfortable with. Both times he had registered the house the way visitors generally did, as something impressive and slightly overwhelming. A 19th century stone manor set back from the road behind old-growth oaks, with a formal garden on the south side and a carriage house that had been converted into what Victoria used as her home office. But this morning, with the October light coming down sideways through the oak canopy and most of the leaves turned deep copper and amber and still holding on by the thinnest margins, the property looked different to him. Quieter, more private, like something that existed at a remove from the world it bordered, self-contained and slightly melancholy in the way of beautiful old things that have outlasted most of the people who knew them when they were new. He parked in the circular drive and sat in his truck for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he got out and rang the bell. Victoria answered herself, which surprised him. She was dressed practically. Dark trousers, a simple cream sweater, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a loose arrangement that managed to look both casual and precisely considered. She looked exactly as he remembered her, which was to say, she looked like a woman who had spent decades being the most composed person in any room and had gotten so good at it that she no longer had to try. "Nathan," she said, "thank you for coming. Come in." The house smelled of old wood and something faintly floral. Dried flowers, he thought, or a candle that had been burning somewhere and recently extinguished. The entry hall had a black and white marble floor and a staircase that curved upward in a way that managed to be grand without being ostentatious. He followed Victoria down a wide corridor toward the east wing, past framed architectural drawings and a series of oil paintings that he assumed were either very good prints or very casually displayed originals. "Coffee?" she offered, without breaking stride. "Sure. Thank you." "After," she said. "I want to show you the problem first. I've been thinking about it since Wednesday, and I'm nearly certain the issue is the angle of approach from the hallway, but I want a second opinion before I commit to a solution." He almost smiled again. She spoke about the furniture problem with the same focused seriousness she probably brought to rezoning applications and construction cost analysis. He found it, unexpectedly, charming. The east drawing room was a large, high-ceilinged space with 2 tall windows overlooking the south garden, a fireplace that hadn't been used in what looked like years, and furniture arranged in the careful, slightly stiff configuration of a room that was decorated to be admired rather than inhabited. In the middle of the doorway connecting the drawing room to the adjacent study, a doorway that was, Nathan assessed immediately, about 34 inches wide, sat a wing-backed armchair of truly impressive dimensions. It was upholstered in deep green velvet, sitting heavily on carved wooden feet, and it was wedged in the doorway at an angle that suggested someone had been confident in their approach, and then very quickly been proved wrong. Nathan stood in front of it with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at it for a long moment. "It went in on the diagonal," Victoria said, coming to stand beside him. "I thought if we angled it—" "The arms," Nathan said. "The arms are wider than the frame appears because of the velvet. You're losing about 1.5 inches on each side that doesn't show up in a visual measurement." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I didn't measure the arms separately. Most people don't." He crouched down, looked at the chair's position, looked at the door frame, did the geometry in his head. We can get it out. You'll need to tilt it about 30 degrees off vertical, lay it almost on its side, and pull it through on a slight upward angle. It'll want to catch on the upper door frame on the right side. You'll need someone on each end. Victoria looked at the chair, then at him. You're the only someone I have available at the moment. My housekeeper is off on weekends, and I sent both of my staff home this morning because I thought I'd solved it during the week. Nathan straightened up. Okay. It took them 11 minutes and 2 genuinely failed attempts before they found the right combination of angle and motion. The chair was heavier than it looked, dense with age and the particular solidity of furniture built in an era when things were made to outlast their owners, and navigating it through the doorway required a level of physical coordination between two people who had never worked together before and were both too proud to admit when they needed a moment to reconsider. The second failed attempt left the chair jammed tighter than before. With Nathan leaning his full weight against one arm and Victoria braced against the doorframe on the opposite side, both of them breathing harder than either would have liked, the chair absolutely immovable between them. I think, Nathan said from his position pressed against the velvet arm, that we made it worse. Yes, Victoria said, from her side of the doorframe, with the particular controlled exhale of someone who had not laughed at themselves in a very long time and was fighting the impulse now. I think you're right. He looked at her around the edge of the chair. She looked back at him. Her hair had come slightly loose from its arrangement on one side, and there was a faint flush in her face from the exertion, and she was holding herself with that trademark composure, but her eyes were bright with something she was actively working to suppress, and he could see the exact moment she lost the fight. The laugh started quietly and then became, briefly, entirely genuine, warm and unguarded, and completely at odds with the polished public version of Victoria Ashcroft that Nathan had held in his memory for 4 years. She pressed her free hand over her mouth and then gave up on that too, and for a moment she was simply a woman who had gotten a very expensive chair stuck in a doorway and found it funny, and the professional armor she wore so constantly was just gone. Present 1 second and absent the next, like a light switched off. Nathan found himself laughing too, partly at the chair and partly at the situation and partly at something else he couldn't have articulated precisely. The sheer unexpectedness of this moment, the two of them jammed in a doorway with a 19th century French armchair between them, laughing. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then they both pulled themselves back together. Okay, Nathan said, catching his breath. We try it differently. We tip it vertical, standing straight up, arms pointing at the ceiling. The widest point becomes the height, not the width. It'll be tall and awkward, but it should clear the frame. Victoria straightened, smoothed her sweater, recovered her composure with the practiced ease of long habit. That's not how furniture is supposed to be moved. No, Nathan agreed, but the chair doesn't know that. The third attempt worked. They maneuvered the chair through standing nearly vertical, Nathan bearing most of the weight from below, and Victoria guiding the upper end with a steadiness that surprised him. She was stronger than she looked, or more determined, or both. And it cleared the upper door frame by maybe an inch and came through into the drawing room with a sound like a soft exhale. They set it down, stood back from it. Nathan rolled his shoulder, which had taken most of the impact on the final push. There, Victoria said. She was slightly out of breath, standing beside the successfully relocated armchair, looking at it with an expression he couldn't fully read. Satisfaction, maybe, and something quieter underneath it. There, Nathan agreed. She turned to look at him, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite discomfort, but a heightened awareness, like she was registering the moment fully for the first time since he'd arrived. Coffee, she said. I promised you coffee. Come through to the kitchen. The kitchen was at the back of the house, less formal than the rooms he had passed through, with stone countertops and old copper fixtures and a window above the sink that looked out over what had been a kitchen garden and had mostly gone to the quiet disorder of late October. Dried stalks, bare soil, the structural remains of growing things that had already finished their season. Victoria moved through the space with the automatic competence of someone who knew exactly where everything was and didn't have to think about it. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, a long farm table of dark wood that had the comfortable solidity of something used regularly, and watched her without quite meaning to. How long have you had the house? He asked, because the silence felt like it needed filling and the house itself seemed like safe territory. My husband and I bought it in 1997, she said, without turning from the coffee maker. It needed significant restoration. The east wing had water damage going back 30 years that the sellers had documented, but perhaps not fully disclosed. We spent the first 4 years essentially rebuilding the structural interior while keeping the exterior intact. A brief pause. That was what got me interested in historic preservation. Before that, I was focused on new construction. The house changed my thinking. What kind of water damage? She glanced back at him over her shoulder, and there was something in the look. A mild surprise quickly adjusted. He understood it. Most people who heard the story probably made the appropriate sounds and moved on. He had asked a follow-up question. The east foundation had shifted about 1.5 inches over 70 years, she said. Just enough to crack the mortar at the base of the east wall and let ground moisture in along the entire seam. The contractor we hired initially missed it because he was looking at the water staining on the interior plaster and not the foundation. We caught it because my husband, Edward, had done some civil engineering work early in his career and recognized the crack pattern. Differential settlement, Nathan said. If the soil composition changed across the foundation footprint, different compaction rates. Yes. She set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table with her own, and looked at him with that same mild recalibration happening behind her eyes. Exactly that. The southeast corner of the foundation was sitting on fill soil from an old outbuilding that had been demolished in the 1940s. Nobody had a record of it. How did you solve it? Helical piers, 12 of them driven down to bedrock on the southeast corner, and then 2 years of controlled re-leveling, quarter-inch increments every 6 weeks to let the structure adjust without cracking the plaster above. She said it straightforwardly, not performing expertise, just recalling. It worked. The east wing has been stable since 2003. Nathan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her. You know more about structural repair than most engineers I work with. I've had to, she said simply. 30 years of buying old buildings teaches you things that don't appear in textbooks. She looked at her coffee. Or it teaches you to ask better questions, at least. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it, more settled. He had come here expecting a brief practical errand and a mildly awkward social obligation, and instead he was sitting in a historic kitchen on a Saturday morning having a genuinely interesting conversation about differential settlement and helical piers, and he was not certain what to do with that. I should ask, Victoria said, with the careful precision of someone who had thought about whether to say something and decided to say it anyway. How is Lily? Lily, his daughter. 5 years old, currently spending Saturday morning at his sister's house 2 towns over, probably terrorizing the family dog with unconditional affection and requests to watch the same animated movie she had watched 11 consecutive times this month. She's great, Nathan said, and the thing that happened to his face when he talked about his daughter was something he had no control over, a kind of involuntary softening, a warmth that came up before he could manage it. She's 5. She's at the stage where she has very strong opinions about everything and will explain them to you at length. Something moved through Victoria's expression, soft and quick and then contained. That sounds about right for 5. She told me this week that triangles are her favorite shape because they are the most serious shape. I don't know where she got that. She was completely certain about it. Victoria looked at him for a moment. She's not wrong, actually, she said quietly. Structurally speaking. Nathan looked at her. She looked back at him. The kitchen held them both in the October morning light coming through the window over the dormant garden, and Nathan felt something stir in him. Not quite what he would have called attraction, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A recognition. The particular feeling of sitting across from someone and thinking, unexpectedly, "You are more interesting than I had prepared myself for." He finished his coffee. He thanked her. He drove home. He told himself all the way home that it was nothing. A pleasant morning, an interesting woman, an unusual but ultimately uncomplicated errand for a former acquaintance. He almost believed it. But he had been 29 when he met Claire Ashcroft at a structural engineering conference in Boston, which was not a natural hunting ground for romantic possibility, but which had, against all probability, produced one. She had been attending as a representative of her mother's company, learning the development side of the business before moving fully into the executive track. And he had been presenting a paper on seismic reinforcement in pre-war residential structures that had been more nervously prepared than it probably needed to be. They had met at the conference dinner, which Nathan had been attending primarily for the free meal, and Claire had introduced herself with the kind of direct confidence that he had found immediately attractive. She was beautiful in a precise, angular way that photographs captured well, and she was smart, and she was funny in the particular dry manner that the Ashcroft family seemed to carry as a genetic trait. They had dated for 2 years and then been engaged for 14 months before realizing, in the slow, uncomfortable way that honest people eventually have to reckon with, that they worked extremely well together and loved each other in a sincere and affectionate way, and were almost completely wrong for each other as life partners. The ending had not been cruel. There had been no single rupture event, no betrayal, no dramatic confrontation, just a series of honest conversations over the course of about 3 months, in which they had both gradually admitted that the future they had sketched out together looked more like a practical arrangement between compatible adults than anything either of them actually wanted to live in for the rest of their lives. Claire had cried. Nathan had cried once, alone in his truck in the parking garage of his office building on a Tuesday evening in March. They had divided their jointly acquired furniture with a fairness that had been almost painfully adult about it, and then they had wished each other well and walked away from 5 years of each other's lives with the slightly dazed feeling of people who had done the right thing and were not entirely sure how to feel about that. Lily had been a separate timeline entirely, a relationship before Claire, brief and not quite finished in the way he'd believed it was at the time, and the phone call informing him that he was going to be a father had arrived 6 weeks after his engagement to Claire had ended, as though the universe had particular opinions about his schedule. He had never regretted Lily for a single day, not for a single hour. He had rearranged his entire existence around being her father, and he had done it without resentment or reservation, and anyone who spent more than 20 minutes with Nathan Holloway and his daughter could see that the rearrangement had not cost him anything. It had clarified him, given him a gravity he had been lacking before. But it had also meant that at 33 he was a man with a complicated history, a 5-year-old, a job that demanded 60 hours a week to do properly, and a very efficient set of emotional defenses that he had constructed so carefully and maintained so consistently that he had almost stopped noticing they were there. Almost. He did not hear from Victoria again for 12 days. He thought about that phone call more often than he should have. Not with longing exactly. He didn't think it was longing, but with the specific quality of unfinished attention you give to something that doesn't quite fit the category you've assigned it. He had filed the morning away under pleasant, unremarkable, done, and yet it kept surfacing. The way she had laughed, unguarded, with her hand over her mouth. The things she had said about triangles being the most serious shape. The kitchen, and the light, and the dormant garden through the window. He was on a job site in New Britain when she called again. Mid-afternoon, overcast, the kind of gray November day that made everything look slightly provisional. "Nathan, it's Victoria Ashcroft. I'm sorry to bother you." "It's no bother. I have a window frame situation." She said it with a flatness that he recognized immediately as someone who was aware of how this sounded, but was going to say it anyway. "The upper sash in the library has dropped about 3/8 of an inch. The weight cord snapped sometime in the last week. I can see daylight at the top of the frame when it's closed, and with the temperatures dropping. I can come Saturday morning," he said. A pause. "You don't have to do that. Window weights are straightforward. I can have it fixed in an hour." Another pause, slightly longer. "If it's not inconvenient." "It's not." He hung up and stood for a moment on the job site with his phone in his hand, looking at the gray sky over New Britain, and thought, "You are being an idiot, Holloway." Then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. The library window took 40 minutes, not an hour. The weight cord had frayed at the pulley and snapped cleanly. A simple replacement, the kind of repair that old houses required periodically, and that was genuinely straightforward if you knew how sash windows were built, which Nathan did. Victoria was in the room while he worked. She had a book open on the library table. He could see from the corner of his eye that she was reading, or at least performing reading. and after about 10 minutes of silence, she set the book down and watched him work instead. He was aware of being watched without it being uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. He was not someone who generally enjoyed an audience for physical work. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "My grandfather," he said, not turning from the window frame. "He had an old Victorian in Middletown. I spent summers there from age 10 to 16, helping him maintain it. He believed strongly that if you lived in an old house, you owed it to the house to understand how it worked." That's an unusual philosophy. He was an unusual person. Nathan pulled the new cord through the pulley channel and checked the alignment. He was an electrician by trade, but he read architecture books the way other people read novels. He had strong opinions about load paths. "A man of refined taste," Victoria said, and the dry note in her voice was so precisely calibrated that Nathan almost fumbled the cord. He finished the repair, tested the sash. It ran smooth and sealed cleanly at the top. He turned around. Victoria was sitting at the library table with her book closed, her hands folded on top of it, watching him with an expression that was attentive and slightly more open than the composed mask she wore when she was being the CEO of anything. "Coffee?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." In the kitchen, the conversation moved differently than the first time. Less careful, less structured around the neutral ground of the house's history. She asked about his work, and he explained what a structural engineer actually did, in terms that he had calibrated for non-engineers over years of explaining it at dinner parties. And she listened without the polite glazed attention he usually got, and asked 3 follow-up questions that revealed she already understood more about structural mechanics than most people he worked with. He asked about the reception, whether it had gone well. She said it had gone well in the way events she organized always went well, which was to say efficiently and on schedule, and the conversation had moved around the room in the pattern she expected. And by 9 o'clock she had been ready for all 60 people to go home and had said goodnight to each of them with genuine warmth and privately counted the minutes. She said this last part with a matter-of-factness that stopped him. "You didn't enjoy it," he said. "I organized it," she said, as though this were an explanation. Then she seemed to hear how that sounded and looked briefly at her coffee cup. "I have always been better at building things than inhabiting them." He did not say anything to that, but he thought about it all the way home. Nathan picked Lily up from school every weekday at 3:15, which was a logistical negotiation he had worked out with his employer 3 years ago and defended with a ferocity he usually reserved for structural specifications. His sister helped on the days when job sites ran long, and his babysitter, a 22-year-old named Rosa who was studying early childhood education and had a preternatural tolerance for the particular conversational intensity of 5-year-olds, covered the gaps. But the 3:15 pickup was his. He was standing outside Lily's classroom door at 3:14 on any day when he could possibly be there, and the expression on Lily's face when she came through the door and found him waiting had never, in 2 years of this routine, lost the power to make something tighten in his chest. She was small for 5, with his dark hair and a pair of large brown eyes that she had inherited from her mother's side of the family, and she greeted everything in life. The school pickup, her breakfast, a particularly interesting stick found on the sidewalk, with the same absolute and total engagement. Nothing was ordinary to Lily. Everything warranted full attention and frequently a detailed verbal report. That Friday afternoon, walking hand in hand from the school to his truck, she told him about a class art project involving paint that had gone kind of wrong but also kind of interesting, a disagreement with her friend Marcus about whether clouds were alive, and her recent determination that she wanted a dog. "You've mentioned the dog before," he said. "I'm mentioning it again," she said, "for emphasis." He put her in her car seat. "What kind of dog?" "A large one," she said seriously, "with significant ears." He drove home through late afternoon Hartford traffic with Lily narrating the clouds out the window and felt the particular contentment of his actual life, the one he had built carefully from what had been available, settle around him like something solid and dependable. He was fine. He was better than fine. He had Lily and his work, and a reasonable apartment, and a slowly growing savings account, and a handful of friends he could call without preparation. He was not looking for anything. He had not been looking for anything. He thought about the library and the window, and Victoria saying, "I have always been better at building things than inhabiting them," the way she had said it quietly and without self-pity, like a thing she had known for a long time and had simply stopped being surprised by. He was not looking for anything, but something, it was becoming gradually and inconveniently clear, appeared to be looking for him. The third call came on a Tuesday evening, which was a departure from the pattern he had so far established in his head, and which arrived while he was standing at his own kitchen counter eating leftover pasta out of the container because Lily was asleep and he hadn't bothered to plate it properly for one person. "Nathan, it's Victoria. I'm sorry to call in the evening." "It's fine," he said, setting down the container. "What's going on?" This is embarrassing." A breath. "I have a furniture delivery scheduled for Thursday morning. A settee for the upstairs sitting room and 2 side tables. The delivery company will bring them to the door, but they won't do installation, and the sitting room is at the top of the main staircase and around the corner in a way that I suspect involves some geometry," he said. A pause. "Yes." "I can come Thursday morning. What time?" 9 o'clock. "But Nathan, you should know that I will pay you for your time. This is the 3rd time I've bought." "Victoria." He picked up the pasta container again. "Don't. It's fine. I don't want you to feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated." He leaned against the counter. Through the dark hallway, he could just hear the small rhythmic sounds of Lily sleeping. The soft noise she made, almost like she was still narrating things, even unconscious. "I'll see you Thursday at 9. He hung up and stood in his kitchen in the quiet of his apartment at 9:30 on a Tuesday night and thought very specifically about nothing for a long moment. Then he finished his pasta. The settee, on Thursday morning, turned out to require 25 minutes and a specific angle of approach through the upstairs sitting room doorway that Nathan identified on the first try. Victoria stood in his hallway and watched him work with the delivery crew with that attentive expression he was beginning to recognize as her particular mode of genuine interest. Still and focused, head slightly tilted, taking in information. After the delivery crew left, she made coffee again. He stayed an hour longer than the job required. They talked about the house, about historic preservation permit processes, about the particular difficulty of finding contractors willing to do careful restoration work rather than fast replacement work. She talked about a property she had acquired in Providence with a 19th century facade that her company was trying to restore without sacrificing the commercial viability of the development and the tension between those two goals that she had been navigating for 8 months. He talked about a bridge project he had worked on early in his career, a small pedestrian bridge over a creek in a state park that had needed full structural replacement but whose designer had specified materials that matched the original 1930s construction almost perfectly, and how he had found that almost more satisfying than anything he had built entirely new. Victoria looked at him across the kitchen table and said, "You care about that. Not just about whether it holds, about whether it's right." "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had been considering. And then she looked out the window at the dormant garden and was quiet for a moment, and something in her face was different. Not the polished CEO, not the composed hostess, just a woman sitting in her kitchen on a Thursday morning, thinking about something she hadn't said yet and deciding whether to say it. She didn't say it. The moment passed, but he noticed it. He noticed it, and he filed it away in the same category as the laugh in the doorway and the thing about building versus inhabiting. And the category was getting full enough that he was going to have to give it a name eventually. He drove home in the gray November morning and thought about what that name might be and was not ready to say it out loud. Not yet. The 4th visit happened without a phone call. Nathan had been driving back from a job site in Glastonbury on a Wednesday afternoon, taking the longer route home out of habit, or something he was telling himself was habit, when he passed the turn for Wethersfield and found himself slowing down without having made a conscious decision to do so. He had a legitimate reason, he told himself. He had noticed on the Thursday furniture delivery that one of the windowsills in the upstairs sitting room had a soft spot near the outer edge, rot working inward from the exterior, the kind of slow damage that looked minor on the surface and wasn't. He had meant to mention it and then forgotten, and it was the responsible thing to make sure a 120-year-old house wasn't quietly falling apart from the outside in. This was what he told himself. He pulled into the circular drive and sat in the truck for a moment, aware that showing up unannounced at Victoria Ashcroft's house was a different category of thing from responding to her calls. Then he got out anyway and rang the bell. She came to the door in the same dark trousers she seemed to favor, but this time with a paint-stained cream blouse she clearly hadn't expected to be seen in because she looked at him for a half-second with an expression of unguarded surprise before the composure reassembled itself. "Nathan." A beat. "I wasn't expecting the windowsill in the sitting room," he said. "The one on the north wall. There's rot starting at the outer edge. You should know before winter sets in." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and he was fairly certain she understood that the windowsill was a partial reason and not the whole one. But she stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." The rot was real. He showed her the soft spot, pressed his thumb into the wood to demonstrate the give, explained what it meant about water infiltration at the exterior joint, and what would need to happen to stop it from spreading. She listened and asked the right questions and wrote something in a small notebook she produced from her cardigan pocket, which he had not expected and found, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, endearing. "I have a contractor who handles exterior restoration," she said. "I'll call him this week." "Good." Nathan pocketed the small knife he'd used to probe the wood. "Catch it now and it's a simple repair. Let it go another winter and you're replacing the entire sill and probably part of the frame." Victoria looked at the window, then out through it at the garden where the last of the dried stalks were bending in a gray November wind. "I've been meaning to address the exterior trim on this side of the house for 2 years, she said. "There's always something more urgent." "There's always something more urgent," he agreed, and then caught himself because that had come out more personal than he meant it to. She glanced at him. "Coffee," she said. Not a question this time. In the kitchen, something was different. He noticed it before he could have said what it was. A quality of ease, maybe, that had not been present in the earlier visits. The careful social calibration they had both been performing, the slight formality of people navigating a situation with acknowledged history, had worn down at the edges without either of them deciding it should. She moved around the kitchen without the slight self-consciousness of someone managing a guest. He sat at the farm table without the slight watchfulness of someone remembering he needed to be careful. He stayed 2 hours. At some point she opened a bottle of wine. A good one, he gathered from the label, though he would not have known otherwise. And neither of them commented on the transition from afternoon coffee to an early evening glass as though it were a significant threshold being crossed. She told him about her company, not the public version, the glossy statements about portfolio growth and market position that appeared in quarterly reports, but the actual version, the texture of it. The board meeting 3 weeks ago, where she had held a position she believed in for 45 minutes against the unanimous skepticism of 6 men who had been managing risk aversion as though it were an achievement. The junior architect on her design team, whose work she had been quietly protecting for a year from a senior VP who found originality unsettling. The Providence project and the 8 months of permit negotiations, and what it was costing her, not financially, but in the specific currency of sustained attention paid to something that refused to resolve. "Do you ever want to stop?" Nathan asked. Not provocatively, genuinely. She turned her wine glass by the stem, a slow half-turn, and looked at it. "Stop what, specifically?" "Any of it. The company, the scale of it." A long pause. "I built Ashcroft Property Group from 11 employees and 2 properties in 1994, she said. "I have thought about stopping in the abstract the way you think about a foreign country you might visit someday, as a concept. But I don't know what I would be without the work." She said this without drama, just the particular flatness of long-held truth. "That's probably a problem, but it's my problem, and I've made my accommodations with it." Nathan looked at her across the table. "Edward," he said carefully, "was he—" He stopped, uncertain of his right to the question. "He understood the work," Victoria said. "He came from a similar background. His family developed commercial real estate in New England for 3 generations, so he understood what it required, what it took." She was quiet for a moment. "Whether he minded what it took is a different question, one I've never answered to my own satisfaction." Edward Ashcroft had died of a cardiac event 4 years ago. Nathan knew this much from Claire, who had talked about her father with a complicated grief that involved not quite enough shared history to grieve cleanly. The marriage had lasted 26 years. Victoria had been 34 when she married him, 22 years into the marriage when he died. Nathan did not know what to say, so he said the truthful thing. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She shook her head slightly. "I mean that not as a deflection. I've done my grieving. I miss him in specific ways on specific occasions. But I was so deep inside the company by the time he died that I barely surfaced, and I think—" She stopped, considered. "I think he would have found that appropriate, which is perhaps its own kind of problem." Nathan turned his own glass slowly. Outside the kitchen window, full dark had arrived at some point without his noticing, and the dormant garden was invisible now, just the faint reflection of the kitchen's warmth in the glass. "My situation is different," he said, which was not a statement that required clarification, but which he found himself clarifying anyway. "With Lily's mother, it wasn't a long relationship. She lives in Seattle now. We're cordial. Lily talks to her on video calls on Sunday mornings, and it's fine. Good, even, most of the time." He paused. "But the dad role was always going to be mine alone. That was clear early, and I made peace with it." "You did more than make peace with it," Victoria said, and there was something in her voice, quiet and certain, that made him look up. "From what I've observed, you built your entire life around her." "She's worth building a life around," he said, completely without effort. Victoria looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't categorize. Not pity, not admiration exactly, not sentiment, something more grounded than all of those. Like she was seeing something clearly that she wanted to see clearly. Then she looked at her wine glass, and the moment passed. He left at 7:15, which was later than he had planned when he pulled into the drive. He sat in the truck for a moment before starting the engine. He was a careful man generally. He thought before he acted. He did not make a habit of wandering into emotionally complicated situations without at minimum acknowledging that they were emotionally complicated. This was becoming emotionally complicated. He started the engine and drove home. November deepened. The oak canopy over Victoria's drive dropped its last leaves in a single hard windstorm, and the property looked different without them. More exposed, more architectural, the house standing alone against the sky without the softening frame of autumn color. Nathan noticed this on his 5th visit, which was for a leaking wall in the basement. A real problem. Genuine moisture infiltration at a foundation joint on the south side that required his professional attention, and also, less professionally, 3 hours and another bottle of wine and a conversation about what it meant to raise a child when you were fundamentally uncertain about most other things. He had told her more about Lily that evening than he had told most people, about the specific texture of loving someone who was entirely dependent on you and entirely unafraid, who greeted the world with a completeness of trust that you spent every day trying to be worthy of. About the loneliness that came with single parenthood that nobody warned you about accurately. Not the loneliness of adult company or romantic partnership, but the loneliness of carrying the full weight of another person's future without anyone to hand it to when you were tired. Victoria had listened without offering reassurances, which he appreciated more than he could have said. People who hadn't raised children alone tended to offer reassurances that slid off the surface of the actual experience. She just listened and asked occasional questions, and at one point looked at the kitchen table and said, "That loneliness you're describing, the weight of full responsibility with no one to hand it to." She paused. "I've run a company for 30 years. I know exactly what that is." He looked at her. "It's not the same thing," she added quickly. "No," he agreed, "but it's adjacent." They sat with that for a moment, two people who had organized their lives around large responsibilities and discovered that organizational competence did not prevent loneliness. It just dressed it differently. "Do you ever feel like you performed yourself into a corner?" he asked. "Like you built a version of yourself that was so functional and capable that people stopped checking whether you were okay?" Victoria was still for a long beat. "Yes," she said, quietly, precisely, like pressing a thumb against something sore to check if it was still there. "That is exactly what happened. And then you maintain the performance because it's the only version of yourself that the situation has room for. And then—" She stopped. "And then you're not sure if there's another version left," Nathan finished. She looked at him sharply. Not offended. Something else. "How old are you?" 33. You're too young to know that already. I've been a single parent for 5 years, he said. It compresses things. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then she looked at her hands on the table and was quiet, and Nathan watched the familiar composure work to reassemble itself and felt, for the first time, something like impatience with it. Not at her, at the reflex, at whatever years of being Victoria Ashcroft had trained her to do with moments of genuine disclosure. For what it's worth, he said carefully, I'm not asking you to perform anything. She met his eyes, held them. I know, she said. And then, that's what makes it hard. He drove home with that sentence sitting in the passenger seat the whole way. December arrived cold and gray, and Lily developed strong opinions about the Christmas tree and whether it was tall enough, which occupied most of Nathan's non-working hours for approximately 10 days. He bought a tree that was not tall enough by Lily's assessment, then exchanged it for one that was too tall, then spent an evening with a handsaw and a level of parental commitment that he felt should be documented somewhere, trimming the base until it fit under the living room ceiling with approximately 2 inches to spare. Lily supervised from the couch with the intensity of a project manager who had waited 5 years for this assignment. It's leaning, she said. It's not leaning. It's leaning to the left. Nathan stepped back and looked at the tree. It was fractionally leaning to the left. It's a tree, he said. Trees lean sometimes. They grew in nature. This one is in our house now, Lily said. It should be professional. He had texted Victoria the tree story that night, which was itself a crossing of a threshold. Not her calling him about the house, but him reaching out in the ordinary way people reached out to people they had been thinking about. He had not thought about it until after he sent it, and then he had sat with his phone in his hand for a moment, aware of what he had done. She had texted back 14 minutes later. A structurally sound and professionally upright tree is a reasonable standard. I'd argue she has sound instincts. He had laughed in his empty apartment at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, which was something he did not do enough of. After that, text became part of the pattern. Not frequently, not every day, nothing that could be categorized as constant contact, but occasionally and easily in the way of people who have found each other's company genuinely valuable and no longer need a formal reason to acknowledge it. She sent him a photograph one afternoon of a cracked plaster medallion on the dining room ceiling, asking whether it was structural or cosmetic. He sent back 3 voice messages walking through how to determine the difference and why it mattered. She sent him an article about a historic mill complex in Rhode Island that was being converted into mixed-use residential development, with a one-line note, "Thought you'd find the structural challenges interesting." He read the article in his truck during a lunch break and sent back a paragraph about the specific difficulties of converting mill buildings and his admiration for how the architect had handled the load redistribution, and she responded with a paragraph of her own that made clear she had thought about the problem in some detail. It was the kind of correspondence that had no natural label. It was not flirtatious. Neither of them deployed that energy, and he would have noticed if she had, would have pulled back by reflex. It was not the careful social exchange of former acquaintances maintaining a polite connection. It was something more comfortable than both, and more charged than either, and he had stopped pretending to himself that it was simply friendly professional interest somewhere around the 3rd week of November. The dinner happened in the 2nd week of December and was not technically planned. Nathan had come to assess the moisture problem on the south foundation wall, a follow-up visit to check whether the temporary seal he had applied in November was holding before winter froze the soil and made external work impossible until spring. He had arrived at 4, done the inspection, determined the seal was holding adequately, and was washing his hands at the utility sink in the basement when Victoria appeared at the top of the basement stairs and said there was pasta if he wanted to stay. He wanted to stay. Lily was at Rosa's that evening, a scheduled overnight that happened once a month to give Nathan what Rosa called adult hours, which he generally spent working late, or catching up on administrative project correspondence, and occasionally, guiltily, just sitting in the quiet of his apartment and staring at the ceiling. He stayed. Victoria cooked this way she did most things, without performance, but with complete attention, moving through the kitchen in the efficient, unhurried way of someone who had made this particular meal before and knew exactly what it needed. It was a simple pasta, nothing elaborate, but made with the kind of care that was evident in the result. each component present and considered. They ate at the farm table with a bottle of wine between them, and outside the kitchen windows the December dark was complete, and the old house held the warmth in the way old houses do, with a solidity that felt almost deliberate. He had been in that kitchen 6 times now, and it had stopped feeling like someone else's space. That should have been a warning sign. He noted it and set it aside. "Can I ask you something?" he said, about halfway through the meal. She looked up. "When did you last take time? Not for the house, not for the company, just take time for something that was only for you." Victoria turned her fork between her fingers, a slow, considering gesture. Define time. An afternoon, a weekend, something you wanted to do that had no practical application. She thought about this for longer than the question should have required, which was itself an answer. "I used to paint," she said finally. He hadn't expected that. "Paint?" "Watercolor, mostly. Landscapes. I studied it at university. I was a studio art major for 2 years before I shifted to business. I was not exceptional at it," she added, with the familiar dry deflation, "but I was committed. I found it clarifying. The practice of looking at something carefully enough to render it. It forces a specific kind of attention." "When did you stop?" She looked at the wine glass. "When the company became what it is, sometime in the early 2000s. I kept telling myself I'd return to it when things slowed down." A pause. Things did not slow down. Nathan looked at her across the table. "You should paint something." "I'm 55 years old, Nathan." "I'm aware. What does that have to do with it?" She looked at him. Something in her expression did the thing it sometimes did. A slight tightening, a resistance. And then underneath it, the faint movement of something she was keeping contained. "You say things very directly," she said. "You're capable of hearing direct things," he said. "I noticed that early." She was quiet for a moment. "You noticed things about me early," she said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. The kitchen held them in the silence that followed, and Nathan was aware, fully, without the comfortable buffer of self-deception he had been maintaining for 6 weeks, of what was happening between them. Not as something abstract or potential or theoretical, as something present and specific and already well underway. He was sitting at this woman's kitchen table at 9 o'clock on a December night, having driven 40 minutes out of his way, and he had not for a single moment wanted to leave, and he knew she knew it, and she had made pasta. He was 33 years old, and she was 55, and she was Claire's mother, and one of the most recognizable CEOs in New England, and he had calloused hands and a 5-year-old in a truck with 140,000 miles on it. He was also, he thought, the only person who had sat across this kitchen table from her in years and meant everything he said. He left at 10. She walked him to the door, which she did not always do, and stood in the doorway as he went down the front steps, and he turned back at the bottom of them because he needed to see her expression. She was looking at him with the composure fully present but not quite intact, like something underneath it was pressing steadily against the surface, and she was deciding how much pressure to apply from the other side. He raised a hand. She lifted one back. He drove home and did not pretend, not even once, that this was nothing. 3 days before Christmas, Lily asked him, in the direct way that 5-year-olds ask things that arrived without preparation, whether he was happy. They were decorating the tree. Lily had strong opinions about ornament placement that Nathan had mostly stopped arguing with, accepting the role of ornament retriever while she exercised full creative authority. "What do you mean?" he said, handing her a small glass ball. "You smile more," she said, placing the ornament with precision. "At your phone sometimes, when you don't know I'm looking." Nathan looked at his daughter, who was 6 inches from the tree, studying its branches with the seriousness of a curator, and felt something move through him, a kind of tender, helpless exposure, the particular feeling of being known by someone who had no capacity for strategic knowledge. "I'm happy," he said. "I'm always happy with you." "I know that," Lily said, pulling back from the tree to assess her work. "I meant other happy, different happy." She glanced at him. "They're not the same." He handed her another ornament. "No," he said quietly, "they're not the same." Lily nodded once, satisfied, and turned back to the tree. She had the quality, sometimes, of a very small person who understood more than she had vocabulary for, and who didn't need you to explain it so long as you were honest. Nathan stood in his living room in the colored light of the imperfectly upright Christmas tree and thought about Victoria in her kitchen, the dormant garden through the window, the way she laughed when she let herself, the painting she had stopped doing 20 years ago because something more urgent always needed attention, and thought, this is what that different happy feels like, and I don't know what to do with it, and I'm running out of reasons to pretend I don't have to figure that out. The tree lights blinked slowly in the quiet of the apartment. Lily hummed something tuneless under her breath, the way she did when she was concentrating. Outside, the December dark settled around the building, cold and steady and indifferent. Inside, his whole careful life was starting to rearrange itself around something new, and he wasn't sure yet whether to stop it. He was not sure he could. January was cold in the specific way of New England winters that had given up pretending to be anything other than what they were, raw and gray and unapologetic, with a wind that came off the river and found every gap in every collar and meant it personally. Nathan drove out to Wethersfield on the second Saturday of the new year to check on the South Foundation seal after the first hard freeze, which was a legitimate reason and also the kind of legitimate reason he had stopped examining too closely because the examination always arrived at the same place. He had spent 2 weeks of the holiday not seeing her. The density of Christmas with Lily, his sister's family visiting, a job site emergency on the 27th that had consumed 3 days, and he had noticed the absence the way you noticed a sound that had been present for months and then stopped. The foundation seal had held. He spent 20 minutes in the basement confirming it, made notes, came back up to the kitchen where Victoria had coffee already made because she had heard his truck in the drive, and sat down across from her at the farm table and felt the particular quality of ease that this kitchen had developed for him. Warm and settled and slightly dangerous, the way comfortable things were sometimes dangerous. "Happy New Year," she said. "Happy New Year." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the window, the dormant garden was covered in a thin crust of snow that had frozen overnight into something more permanent-looking than it was. "The seal held," he said. "Good. You'll want to have someone address the exterior joint properly in the spring, before the ground thaws and the water table rises. I'll call the contractor." "Good." The conversation had covered its practical ground, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved, and the kitchen was very quiet. "I made soup," Victoria said. "If you're not in a hurry." He was not in a hurry. They ate at the farm table with the January light coming gray and flat through the window, and the conversation moved in the way it had learned to move between them, easily, without the careful scaffolding of social performance. She talked about a board meeting she had in Boston on Tuesday and the specific exhaustion of spending 4 hours in a room with people who treated caution as a virtue. He talked about a project he was starting in February, a residential development in Avon whose builder had made a series of structural decisions during the framing phase that Nathan was going to have to address diplomatically because the builder was also a partial investor. "How do you handle that?" she asked. "Telling someone that what they built is wrong without making it personal." "I stick to the specifications," he said. "This is what the design calls for. This is what was built. This is the gap. It's not about what you did. It's about what needs to happen now." He paused. "It doesn't always work. Some people take their buildings personally. Some people are their buildings," Victoria said. He looked at her. "I mean that about myself," she said. "In case it wasn't clear, Ashcroft Property Group is not separate from me, for better and worse." "And which is it today?" She was quiet for a moment. "Today it's mostly worse," she said honestly, and looked out the window at the frozen garden. "I spent the last week of December in the office, not because I needed to be there. I chose to be there, because the alternative was being here, in this house, with nothing that required my particular skill set." Nathan looked at her. She was looking at the window, not at him, and her profile in the January light was tired, he thought. Not the polished CEO's face that appeared in company photographs. Just a 55-year-old woman who had built something large enough to live inside of and had recently noticed that the inside was quiet. "You're describing a trap," he said. "Yes." She turned back to look at him. "I'm aware it's a trap. Awareness doesn't always constitute escape." "What would escape look like?" "I have no idea," she said. "That's the honest answer. I've been doing this for 30 years. I don't have a second model. I don't know what Victoria Ashcroft looks like when she's not running something. He thought about the painting. He did not say it again. He had said it once and she had heard it, and saying it twice would have been a different kind of statement. But he thought about it. She looks like this, he said instead, and gestured simply at the kitchen, at the soup, at the ordinary Saturday morning that they were sitting inside of together. I think this is what she looks like. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. The composure was present but thin. He could see the warmth working underneath it, pressing at the surface the way the frost pressed at the foundation joint, gradual and insistent and unwilling to be permanently contained. "Nathan," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "We're not—" She stopped, tried again. "This isn't something simple. I know that too. I'm 22 years older than you. Yes, I was Claire's mother. Yes. The company, my profile, but people pay attention to what I do, It's not private. It would not be private. I know." She looked at him with an expression that was the most unguarded he had seen on her face since the doorway with the armchair, since the laughing, that first day, when the armor had come off briefly and he had seen the person underneath it. "You know all of that," she said, "and you're still sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning." "I've been sitting at your kitchen table on Saturday morning since October," he said. "At some point, that stops being an accident." The kitchen held them in the silence that followed, and Nathan felt the particular weight of a moment in which the comfortable ambiguity of the preceding months was coming to its natural end. They had been existing in the middle space, close enough for honesty, far enough to maintain the fiction of simple friendship. And the middle space was running out of room. Victoria looked at the table. She pressed 2 fingers against the wood grain, a small, unconscious gesture. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I know how to run things. I know how to manage complexity and hold positions under pressure and keep my composure when rooms full of people need me to. I genuinely do not know how to—" She stopped. "This, neither do I," Nathan said. "I've been raising a 5-year-old alone for 5 years, and before that I was engaged to your daughter. My personal history is not exactly a guidebook." She looked up at him. Something almost like humor moved through her eyes. "But I keep coming back," he said. "Every time. And I don't come back for the foundation walls, Victoria." The words sat between them on the kitchen table, plain and unretractable. And Nathan felt the specific vulnerability of having said a true thing out loud to someone who had the full capacity to make it hurt. She did not look away. "I keep calling you," she said. "I'm aware that I keep finding reasons to call you. The window, the furniture, the foundation." Her voice was very even. "I'm not as oblivious about my own motivations as I sometimes pretend to be." "I know," he said. I needed you to say it first," she admitted, and the admission cost her something he could see in the brief tightening around her eyes. "Which is cowardly, but true." "It's not cowardly," he said. "You have more to lose." "So do you," she said quickly. "You have Lily. I have Lily," he agreed. "And she has spent the last 2 weeks asking me whether I'm happy. The other kind of happy." Her words. He paused. "She's 5 years old, and she already knows the difference." Victoria was very still. "I'm not saying this is simple," Nathan said. "I'm not saying I know how it works or what it looks like or what anybody else is going to think about it. I genuinely don't know any of that." He looked at her steadily. "But I know that I think about you when I'm not here, and when I'm here, I don't want to leave, and I have not felt that about anything in a very long time." The January light held steady in the kitchen window. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the road beyond the gates, and its sound came faintly through the old walls and then was gone, and the house was quiet again. Victoria looked at him with the composure assembled, but her eyes entirely unguarded, and he thought, "There she is. There's the person underneath all of it." "What do we do with that?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I think we stop pretending we don't have to figure it out." She nodded, very slightly, and looked at the table again, and the kitchen held them both in the winter quiet, and nothing was resolved and nothing was promised, and something had changed permanently anyway. They did not kiss that day. He left at noon, walked to his truck in the cold January air, and drove home through a city that looked ordinary and felt slightly different than it had that morning, and did not know precisely what had just happened except that it had happened and there was no path back to before it. The figuring out happened slowly over the following 3 weeks, in the specific way that two careful people negotiate something they both want and both have reason to be afraid of. Victoria called on a Thursday evening, not about the house, just called, which was itself a kind of statement, and they talked for an hour and a half about nothing urgent, which was more intimate than most of the specific disclosures they had made over coffee and soup. He came back to the house the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, each visit longer than the stated reason required, each conversation moving further into the territory they had tacitly agreed to allow themselves. She was not an easy person to know. He had understood this from the beginning, but understood it more fully now. She was accustomed to managing her own emotional landscape with the same precision she brought to everything else, directing and containing and channeling rather than simply experiencing. When something moved her, she noted it and filed it rather than letting it move her in real time. It was a kind of discipline that had served her extremely well for 30 years, and which was, he had come to understand, also a profound loneliness dressed in the language of capability. He was patient with it. Not strategically. He was not a strategic person in matters that were not structural, but genuinely, because he recognized the pattern. He had done his own version of it for years. The careful self-containment of someone who had learned that feeling things fully in real time was expensive and had adapted accordingly. He was patient, and she noticed the patience, and he watched her decide incrementally to trust it. In the 3rd week of January, she called him at 7 in the morning, which had never happened before. And when he answered, she said, "I found my watercolors. They were in a box in the carriage house with some of my university things. I want you to know I'm not going to do anything with them. I just wanted to tell someone I found them." He was standing in his kitchen making Lily's school lunch, phone wedged between his ear and shoulder. "Okay," he said. "They're probably ruined," she said. "The paint's dried out." "Probably," he agreed. "But the paper might be okay." A pause. "Yes, the paper might be okay." "Tell me what you painted," he said. "When you painted." She told him, standing presumably somewhere in the carriage house with a box of 30-year-old watercolors, about the landscape she had made in college. The coastline of Maine, where her family had a summer property, the harbor, the light on the water in early morning when it was flat and silver and very still. She had a particular memory of a painting she had made in her junior year that she had genuinely loved, a small harbor scene 6 inches by 8, in which she had somehow captured the particular gray-green color of the Atlantic in October, a color that she had never quite been able to reproduce afterward, and that she had thought about in the specific way you thought about a thing you had made that had briefly exceeded your own understanding of your capabilities for decades. "Paint the garden," Nathan said. "It's January. The garden is dormant." "Paint it dormant," he said. "That's the interesting version, when everything shows its structure." She was quiet for a moment. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, announcing that she needed breakfast and that her socks were unsatisfactory. And Nathan held up one finger, and she sighed dramatically and leaned against the doorframe to wait. "I'll think about it," Victoria said. "You've been thinking about it since you found the box," he said. A long pause. "Yes," she said. "I have." He finished making Lily's lunch and got her into satisfactory socks and drove her to school and came back to the empty apartment and stood in the kitchen and felt the low, steady warmth of being known, specifically and accurately known, by another person. The warmth of having said real things and had them received and said real things back. It was not a small feeling, but The specific afternoon in late January when everything finally broke open was a quiet one. No particular occasion, no crisis, no practical reason that he needed to be there. Victoria had texted him midday, "Are you working today?" And he had been finishing up project paperwork from home with the particular aimless restlessness of a man who had things he needed to do and was finding it difficult to care about them. And he had texted back, "Not on a site." And she had replied, "Come over if you want." And he had looked at those 4 words for a moment, aware that this was different from a call about foundation walls. He drove to Wethersfield. She answered the door in paint-stained clothes. He looked at the paint on her hands. blue, gray, and green, watercolor stains that had soaked into the lines of her knuckles. And something shifted in his chest so suddenly that he had to keep his face still. "You're painting," he said. "I've been attempting to paint," she said, with the particular self-correction of someone who had spent the day doing something they cared about and were therefore more vulnerable to it than usual. "Come in." She led him through to the sitting room at the back of the house, a room he had been in but never spent time in, smaller and less formal than the drawing room, with windows on two sides and better natural light. She had set up near the south window, a small table pulled close to the glass with a palette, and water cups, and the paper he had mentioned, and on the table was a small painting, or the beginning of one. The kitchen garden seen through the window, bare soil, dried stalks, the structural remains of the raised beds in the gray January light. He looked at it for a long moment. It was tentative in places, uncertain in the way of a person returning to a skill after a long absence, but there was something in it that was true. The color of the soil under the January sky was exact. The way the dried stalks caught the low winter light in the right side of the composition was observed rather than imagined, rendered with the attention of someone who had looked at the thing carefully enough to actually see it. "It's not finished," she said from behind him, and her voice had a quality he recognized as exposure, the specific tone of someone waiting for judgment on something they genuinely cared about. "I know," he said. "It's good, Victoria. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. It's good." He turned to look at her. "The soil color on the left. How long did it take you to get that right?" She blinked. 40 minutes. I mixed it 4 times. "That's what it looks like, 40 minutes of actual looking." He held her eyes. "You should keep going." Something happened in her face, not the composure break he had seen before, something quieter and more interior, like a door opening inward rather than the usual locked from outside. She was standing in her own sitting room in paint-stained clothes, with her hair pulled back imperfectly and her hands still carrying the colors of the morning's work. And she looked different than he had seen her, more present. Like whatever she had put back in the box in the carriage house 30 years ago was not just the watercolors. "I forgot what this felt like," she said quietly, "making something that had no purpose beyond making it." "Yeah," he said. "It's uncomfortable. That's not—" She shook her head. "I don't usually make things that are uncomfortable to make." "That's probably why it's good," he said. She looked at him, and the look was very direct and very unguarded, and he felt the charge of it from across the room. The January light was white and flat through the south windows, and it made the room simple and clean without shadows. "Nathan," she said. And then she crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the exact color of her eyes in the white winter light. Gray-green, he thought, almost the color of the Atlantic in October. And she looked at him with the full, undefended attention that she had been withholding and protecting and managing for the 4 months he had known her. He reached up and put his hand against the side of her face and felt her exhale, a slow, releasing breath, like something she had been holding for a long time finally allowed to go. And she turned her face very slightly toward his palm, the way you turn toward warmth. He kissed her. It was not a collision, not the desperate, urgent kind that movies preferred. It was careful at first because they were both careful people, and then it became something warmer and more sustained, and she put one paint-stained hand against his chest, and outside the window the January garden was bare and structural and entirely itself. He pulled back eventually, not far, and they stood close in the afternoon quiet. Her eyes were still closed for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything immediately because neither of them had the right words organized yet, and they both knew it. "I've been trying not to do that for 3 months, she said finally. "I know," he said. "I could tell." "Is that smug?" "A little," he said. She made the sound that was almost a laugh and not quite, and he kept his hand against her face, and she did not move away. "I need you to understand something," she said carefully. I don't do things carelessly. I'm not going to pretend this is simple and then be surprised when it isn't. If this is something we're doing, it's something we're doing," he said. She looked at him. "You're very certain." "I'm certain about some things," he said. "Load paths? My daughter? This." She looked at him for a long moment. And there was something happening in her face that was neither composed nor uncomposed. Something truer than both. The expression of a person standing at the edge of something they have chosen with full awareness. The age gap, she said, that's real. It doesn't disappear because we want it to. No. I'm not going to age gracefully into being unaware of it. I know. And Claire. She said it steadily, but he could feel the weight of it. That conversation will happen. It will be difficult. Yes, he said. It will. And the company, the visibility. I cannot control what people say about this, and people will say things. I know that. She was watching him take each thing she named and receive it without flinching, and he could see her checking him, not doubting, but verifying, making sure the person she was looking at was actually the person she thought he was. He had been looked at more carefully in the past 4 months by this woman than he had been looked at by anyone in years, and he did not mind it. It meant she was serious. It meant he was seen. None of that changes anything, he said. For me. I know, she said quietly. That's either the most reassuring thing or the most frightening thing I've ever heard. Maybe both, he said. She nodded. And then she looked at the painting on the table by the window. The bare garden in the January light, tentative and unfinished, and back at him. I've spent 30 years building things that required certainty, she said. Every project, every acquisition. You model the risk, you assess the variables, you commit when the numbers justify commitment. I don't make significant decisions based on, she gestured a small helpless motion. Whatever this is. No, he agreed. But you called me about a chair. She looked at him. October, he said. You had my number in your phone for 4 years and you called me about a chair. You could have called a moving company. You could have called anyone. He held her gaze. You called me. She was very still. So I think you made this decision a while ago, he said. I think the rest of it has been the math you run afterward to make sure the numbers justify what you already know. For a moment she said nothing. Then, that is an extremely inconvenient observation. I know. She closed her eyes briefly, a single slow blink, and when she opened them, something in her face was settled. Not resigned, but decided. The quality of a person who has finished arguing with themselves and accepted the outcome. He recognized it because he had felt it himself, somewhere around the 3rd visit, when he had stopped filing the mornings away under meaningless and started admitting what they actually were. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She looked at the paint on her hands, then up at him with an expression he was going to remember for a long time, something that was equal parts certainty and terror, and something that was not quite happiness, but was its structural predecessor, the thing you felt in the moment before you understood you were going to be happy. I should wash my hands, she said. Probably, he agreed. She went to the kitchen, and he stayed in the sitting room, and he looked at the small unfinished painting by the window. The garden stripped down to its structural bones, bare and honest and waiting for whatever came next, and felt the specific quality of a beginning. Not easy, not simple, not without complications he could fully enumerate and had not stopped enumerating, but real, present, the kind of thing that existed in the actual world rather than the theoretical one, and that he had stopped pretending. On a quiet afternoon in January with white light through the south windows and watercolor on a woman's hands, he did not want. He wanted it. He had wanted it for months. He was done with the math. The painting on the table was still wet, the colors still bright and uncertain in the January light. And outside the window the garden waited, stripped of everything non-essential, entirely and precisely itself. Victoria told Claire on a Sunday in early February, 3 weeks after the afternoon in the sitting room with the watercolors. She had thought about how to do it for all 3 of those weeks. Not obsessively, not with the kind of circular anxiety that produced nothing, but with the deliberate attention she brought to problems that had no clean solution. She had considered calling first, then decided against it. A phone call gave Claire the option to react without being seen, which was an option Victoria did not want to give her. Not because she wanted to watch her daughter's face, but because she believed that real conversations happened in rooms, not across distances. She had always believed that. It was why she still flew to meetings that most of her peers took by video. She called Claire and asked her to come for Sunday lunch, which was not unusual enough to generate alarm. Claire came from New Haven, where she had been working for the past 2 years at an urban planning firm, driving up on the occasional Sunday in the way of adult children who maintained the form of family contact without always filling it with much content. Their relationship was functional and affectionate and slightly carefully calibrated for a specific distance, like a structure designed to bear a known load and no more. Victoria had made the same pasta she had made for Nathan in December, which was either a meaningful choice or an automatic one, and she did not examine which. They ate, and they talked about Claire's current project, a mixed-income development proposal for a brownfield site in Bridgeport that Claire had been working on for 8 months, and about the company's board meeting Nathan had heard about in January, and about the winter, which had been punishing and gray and was showing no signs of relenting. Then they finished eating, and Victoria poured them both coffee, and she set the cups on the table and sat back down and said, "There's something I want to tell you about." Claire looked at her over the coffee. She was 30 years old, her mother's daughter in the bones of her face, with the same directness in her eyes that Victoria had been looking at in her own mirror for 55 years. "Okay," she said, with the particular careful neutrality of someone who understood that there's something I want to tell you. From Victoria Ashcroft was not casual preamble. Victoria told her directly. She had been building toward telling herself a version of this story that would make it easier, one that led with the house repairs, with the practical proximity, with the gradual and reasonable way the whole thing had developed. But sitting across the kitchen table from her daughter, she found she did not want the carefully organized version. She said, Nathan had been coming to the house since October. They had become close. She had feelings for him that she had resisted for months and had stopped resisting 6 weeks ago. She wanted Claire to hear it from her, directly, before she heard it any other way. She said all of this, and then she stopped and waited and watched her daughter's face do several things in rapid succession, each one arriving and departing before a new one replaced it, the way weather moved through a sky that couldn't decide what season it was trying to be. Claire looked at the coffee cup. She turned it by the handle, one slow rotation, without picking it up. The kitchen was very quiet. "Nathan Holloway," she said finally. "Yes." Another silence. "How long have you—" She stopped. "You said October." "The first call was in October. I called him to help rearrange furniture for the reception." Victoria kept her voice even. "I didn't anticipate anything. I want you to understand that." "No," Claire said, not dismissively, more like she was placing the statement in the right location. "No, I believe that." She looked up. "But somewhere between October and now—" "Yes," Victoria said. "Somewhere between October and now." Claire exhaled through her nose. It was not a sound of anger exactly, more of someone who has been handed an object they were not prepared to hold and are figuring out what to do with their hands. Mom, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything immediately. You're telling me you're involved with my ex-fiancé." "Yes." "Who I was engaged to for over a year." "Yes." "And you've been—" Claire pressed 2 fingers to her temple. "You've been seeing him since October, and this is the first I'm hearing of it." "We've been spending time together," Victoria said carefully. "What it became happened gradually. I told you as soon as I knew what it was." Claire looked at her with an expression that was complicated enough to suggest she was running several simultaneous calculations, hurt and confusion, and something that was not quite betrayal but was adjacent to it. And underneath those, because she was her mother's daughter, the beginning of a more analytical consideration of the actual facts. "Do you know what the strange part is?" Claire said finally. "The strange part is that I'm not—" She stopped, started over. "Nathan and we were finished. We finished it ourselves and we both knew it was right. And I moved on. I've moved on." She paused. "But this is my mother. That's a different kind of—" "I know," Victoria said. "It's a different kind of complicated." "I know that too." Claire stood up from the table abruptly and went to the kitchen window, the same window Victoria looked out of every morning, the same view of the garden, and stood there with her back to the room. Victoria waited. She did not try to fill the silence or smooth it or manage it. She had made her choices deliberately, and she was going to sit in their consequences with the same intention. "Is he good to you?" Claire asked, without turning around. The question landed differently than Victoria expected. Not how could you or what were you thinking, but something much more direct and much more painful. She pressed her hands flat against the table. Yes, she said. He is. Claire turned around. Her face had settled into something that was not resolved but was working toward resolution. The expression of a person who is deciding consciously to be larger than their first reaction. It was a face Victoria recognized. She had seen it in her own mirror when she was 30 years old, and life had handed her something she had not chosen and had to decide what to do with. I don't know how I feel about this, Claire said. I want to be honest with you. I don't know. I need time to think about it. That's fair, Victoria said. I'm not going to pretend I'm fine with it just because I've moved on from Nathan. I'm not that sordid. I'm not asking you to be sordid, Victoria said. I'm asking you to know the truth. What you do with that is yours. Claire sat back down. She picked up the coffee cup and held it without drinking. Does Lily know? His daughter. Not what it is. She knows he spends time here. She's 5. She knows what she observes. Claire nodded slowly. And Nathan, he knows what he's getting into? With you, with everything that means. Victoria held her daughter's gaze. He's been told, repeatedly, every complication. He has not been persuaded by a single one of them. Something moved through Claire's face, not softness exactly, more like recognition. That sounds like him, she said quietly. The conversation did not end resolved. Claire drove back to New Haven 2 hours later with the particular quietness of someone carrying something they needed to set down in private before they could know how heavy it was. Victoria stood at the front door and watched her car move down the drive and felt the complexity of motherhood in its full weight. The love and the guilt and the fierce protectiveness and the knowledge that protecting your child sometimes meant telling them things that were hard to hear, and sometimes meant accepting that you could not protect them from everything, including yourself. She went back inside and sat in the kitchen for a long time. She called Nathan that evening. He answered immediately. How did it go? He said. Honestly, Victoria said. Painfully. The way real conversations go. She paused. She didn't tell me it was okay. That's fair. She asked if you were good to me. A beat of silence. What did you say? I said yes. Victoria looked at the kitchen table, the cleared dinner things, the 2 coffee cups she had not yet washed. She said that sounded like you. She could hear Nathan absorbing this, the particular quality of his silences, which she had learned to read, the kind that meant he was sitting with something rather than formulating a response to it. I need to call her, he said. Claire, she should hear from me too. I know, not tonight. No, not tonight. A pause. Are you okay? I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me in a few days. Okay, he said, and then, I'm glad you told her. I know it wasn't easy. Nothing worth doing is easy, Victoria said, and then caught herself because it sounded like something printed on a motivational calendar and not like anything she would normally say. I mean, no, Nathan said, and she could hear the warmth in his voice. That was almost a cliché. Very unlike you. I'm apparently capable of regression under stress, she said. He laughed, the real laugh, the one she had heard only a few times but which she collected, kept, returned to. I'll talk to Claire this week, he said. I'll call you after. Nathan called Claire on a Wednesday evening from his truck, parked outside his apartment building because the apartment felt too small for the conversation and the open air felt more honest. It had been 4 years since they had spoken about anything more substantial than the routine courtesies of people who had loved each other and landed somewhere functional on the other side of it. She answered on the 3rd ring. I wondered when you'd call, she said. I wanted to give you time, he said. After Sunday, Mom told me she was going to tell me. A pause. She didn't tell me you'd be calling this week. She doesn't know every decision I make, he said. Not yet. A short silence, and then Claire made a sound that was complicated, something between exasperation and something more tender. Nathan. I know, he said. I've been thinking about this since Sunday, she said, about what I actually feel. Not what I think I'm supposed to feel, but what I actually feel. Her voice was measured, careful, working through something in real time. And the honest answer is that it's strange. It is genuinely, specifically strange. Yes, he said, it is. You were going to be my husband. I know. And now I know. Another silence. He waited. He had learned, in the years since their engagement ended, that Claire processed by speaking, that her thoughts arrived fully formed in language, and that interrupting the arrival did nothing useful. I was talking to someone about it, she said, a friend, and she asked me whether I was upset because I still had feelings for you or because of what it meant about my mother, and she stopped. And I realized the answer was neither. I was upset because it felt like something that shouldn't be possible, like a category violation, like finding out the rules of the world are different than you understood them. Yeah, Nathan said quietly. That's what it is. You were going to be part of my family, she said, and you became part of my family, just differently. He sat with that for a moment. Outside his truck, the February night was very cold and very still, and the streetlights cast orange circles on the wet pavement, and in an apartment 2 floors up, Lily was asleep with Rosa in the next room. I never meant to, he started. I know you didn't, Claire said. Neither did she. I know both of you well enough to know that. She exhaled. What I couldn't figure out after Sunday was why it bothered me. If I believe both of those things, that neither of you sought this, that neither of you did it carelessly, then what am I actually upset about? Surprise, he said. The fact that nobody asked you. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. Not the choice. The not knowing. A pause. Which is a thing I can deal with. It's a harder thing to be angry at. You can be angry at it anyway, he said. You don't need a rational target. She was quiet for a moment. How are you, Nathan? Genuinely. He thought about the sitting room and the watercolors and the white January light and Victoria's paint-stained hands. I'm good. You're happy, Claire said, not a question. Yes, okay, she said, and the word carried something in it that was not simple, not forgiveness exactly, not approval, but something that was moving in that direction from a starting point of genuine effort. Okay, I'm going to need more time, but okay. That's enough, he said, more than enough. After he hung up, he sat in the truck for another 10 minutes in the cold and thought about the particular exhaustion and relief of difficult conversations that had gone as well as they could possibly go while still being difficult. About Claire's voice saying okay, not resolved, not finished, but willing. About how much courage it took to be willing when you were hurting. He thought she was a good person. He had always thought so. The relationship had been wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with her quality as a person, and the fact that she was sitting in New Haven on a Wednesday night choosing effort over grievance was evidence of exactly that. He texted Victoria. She was honest and it was hard, and she said okay, not fully, but okay. Victoria replied 4 minutes later, that's Claire. She chooses the harder right thing over the easier wrong one. She got that from her father. Then after a moment, I'm proud of her. He read that twice and put his phone in his jacket pocket and went upstairs to his apartment and stood in Lily's doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep, listening to the small sounds she made, feeling the full particular weight of his life. February moved into March with the grudging reluctance of a New England winter that knew it was losing but wasn't finished making its point. The kitchen garden at the Ashcroft property began to show the first tentative evidence of returning life. Small, insistent green at the edges of the beds, crocuses pushing up through the frost-hardened soil in the border beds along the south wall. Victoria photographed them and sent the images to Nathan without comment, and he sent back, "The garden is ahead of schedule." She replied, "It doesn't consult a schedule. That's why it's better at this than I am." He had thought about that exchange more than it probably warranted, which was a thing he had accepted about himself. He thought about the small things she said and found them. The relationship was, by every external measure, not a simple one. Nathan had known this going in, and the knowing had not made it easier when the external world weighed in with its opinions. His sister Diane had been the first person in his life to find out. Not because he had told her, but because Diane had the particular sibling radar that could detect unusual behavior from 3 counties away, and had called him in the second week of February asking if he was seeing someone. He had told her the truth, which had produced a silence of significant duration. "Victoria Ashcroft," Diane said finally. "Yes." "Claire's mother." "Yes." "Who is 55, yes." "Nathan." "I know." Diane had said several things after that, not unkindly, that were essentially the same concerns he had enumerated to himself for months, and he had listened without argument because they were reasonable concerns, and Diane was a reasonable person who loved him. At the end of the conversation, she had said, "You're not someone who does things carelessly. That's the only thing I'm holding on to right now." "I know," he said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I have approximately 40 more concerns I haven't gotten to." "I know that too," he said, and she had laughed despite herself and said she needed a few days, and he had given her the few days, and she had called back and said she wanted to meet Victoria. The meeting happened in March, at the Wethersfield house, on a Saturday afternoon when Lily was with Rosa. Diane arrived with the expression of a woman who had decided in advance to be fair and was determined to honor that decision even if it was uncomfortable, and Victoria received her with a composed courtesy that Nathan recognized as her highest effort mode. Not the warmth she showed in private, but the careful attentiveness she used when she needed someone to trust her, and the trust had to be earned rather than assumed. He watched the two women navigate each other across the kitchen table. Diane direct and observant, asking the questions she needed answered without the softening typically used in polite company. Victoria answering them without deflection or performance, meeting directness with directness because she understood that was the only currency Diane would accept, and felt the specific helplessness of watching two people who were important to him decide what to make of each other without any intervention he could usefully offer. An hour in, the conversation had moved from Nathan and the relationship to Lily, and here something changed. Diane talked about Lily the way she always did, with the particular fierce tenderness of an aunt who had stepped into the gaps that 5 years of single parenthood had occasionally created, and Victoria listened with the focused quality Nathan had seen in the kitchen when she was learning something she genuinely wanted to know. "She sounds like a specific person," Victoria said, not a compliment, an observation. "Already fully herself." "Horrifyingly so," Diane said. "She told me last month that she had decided November was the most honest month because all the trees stopped pretending." Nathan watched Victoria's face. The smile that appeared was not the polished public smile. It was smaller and more genuine and came from somewhere that wasn't managed. "I want to meet her," Victoria said simply. Diane looked at her, then at Nathan, then back at Victoria. She's been through a lot of adjustments in 5 years, Diane said carefully. "She's resilient, but she's also 5 and she pays attention to more than people think." "I understand that," Victoria said. "I'm not asking to be introduced to her as anything. I'm asking if there's a natural occasion, something ordinary. If she's at the house, I'd like to not be a stranger." Diane turned her coffee cup slowly. It was the same gesture Victoria sometimes made, Nathan noticed, and he did not know what to do with the coincidence of it except file it away. "Okay," Diane said finally. "I think that's reasonable." After Diane left, Nathan found Victoria in the kitchen washing the coffee cups, her back to the room, her posture slightly less composed than her front-of-room posture ever was, and he put his hand on her shoulder and felt the breath she let out. "Well?" he said. "She loves you completely," Victoria said, "and she will tolerate me cautiously, which is the right outcome." She turned off the tap and turned around. "She's protective of Lily." "Yes." "Good," Victoria said simply. "Lily should have people like that." Lily met Victoria on a Saturday in late March that arrived with the tentative warmth of a season, trying to remember what it was supposed to be doing. Nathan had brought Lily to the house under the entirely accurate premise that he needed to check on the exterior foundation repair that the contractor had begun the previous week, and Victoria had been in the kitchen when they came through. Genuinely in the kitchen, not staged, rolling out dough for something that had turned the whole room warm and flowery. Lily stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Victoria with the complete unmediated assessment of a 5-year-old encountering something new. "You have paint on your arm," Lily said. Victoria looked at her arm. There was in fact a streak of blue-gray paint on her forearm that she had apparently missed when she changed from her morning painting session. "You're right," she said. "I was painting earlier. I forgot to wash it off." "What were you painting?" Lily asked. "The garden," Victoria said. "Out there." She nodded toward the kitchen window. Lily went to the window and looked at the garden, which was in the specific disorder of early spring. The beds turned and ready, the first plantings just beginning, the bare soil dark with moisture. She studied it with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Why is it interesting to paint?" she asked. "Because it looks different every day," Victoria said. "And painting forces you to look at it carefully enough to see the difference." Lily turned from the window and regarded Victoria with an expression Nathan knew well, the one she wore when she was deciding whether an adult was worth her sustained attention. It was a demanding standard. Not many adults met it quickly. "Can I see?" Lily said. Victoria looked at Nathan. He gave her nothing, deliberately, because this was not his to manage. She looked back at Lily. "The painting isn't finished," she said. "That's okay," Lily said. "I like things that aren't finished. You can see how they're going." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Nathan watched something move through her face, the quality he had identified as her actual self operating without management. And she set down the rolling pin and dried her hands and said, "Come on then." He heard them in the sitting room, Lily's voice asking questions with the relentless curiosity that was her primary mode of existing, Victoria's voice answering in the specific way she answered when she meant it, directly, without condescension, treating the questions as questions rather than as the noise small children made. He heard Lily say something about colors that made Victoria laugh, the real one, and he stood in the kitchen with the dough on the counter and the March light coming through the window and felt the full particular weight of the life that was assembling itself around him without his quite having planned it. He heard Lily say, "Can you teach me?" He heard Victoria say, "If your dad says it's okay." He heard Lily's footsteps coming back to the kitchen at speed. He was already nodding before she got through the door. Spring came. The garden at Wethersfield came back in sections. First the early bulbs and the borders, then the kitchen garden beds as Victoria planted them in April, with a focus and a patience that Nathan recognized as someone rediscovering something they had been missing for a long time. She had read 3 books about kitchen gardening in February. She had taken notes. When he pointed this out, she told him that she approached things she cared about systematically, and he said that was possibly the most Victoria Ashcroft thing she had ever said, and she threw a dish towel at him. He had learned over the months the specific geography of who she was under the professional surface. She was funny in a way that required you to be paying attention. She was stubborn with a precision that was actually principled rather than defensive. She held positions because she had reasoned herself to them, not because she was protecting her ego. She was genuinely, specifically curious about Lily in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She asked questions and remembered the answers, and the next time she saw Lily, she referenced them. And Lily, who had an excellent memory and a finely calibrated sensor for adults who were actually paying attention, had noticed. She was also, some days, difficult. There were weeks in which the company consumed her in ways that left her at the kitchen table with the particular flatness of a person who had been depleted rather than tired, and on those evenings she was not the warm or curious or funny version. She was the managed version, the CEO on autopilot, and Nathan had learned that the correct response was not to push for the other version, but to simply be present, to stay at the table, to talk about ordinary things and not require her to be anything more than she was that evening. She noticed always when he did this, and the noticing was its own kind of conversation. In May, Claire came to the house for the first time since February. She came because Victoria had asked her, and because Claire had, over the preceding 3 months, done the work she had said she needed to do. The visit was not simple. There were moments at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, Nathan having been invited and having considered not coming and come anyway, where the weight of the overlapping histories sat on the room in a way that required everyone to hold something uncomfortable for long enough to decide to keep going. Claire had looked at Nathan across the table and said, "You look different," in a tone that was more observation than accusation. "Good different or bad different?" he asked. She had considered this honestly. "Like you've stopped calculating," she said. He hadn't known what to say to that, so he had said nothing, and Claire had looked at her mother and then back at him, and something in her face had settled. Not completely, not finally, but enough. The enough that was the honest goal of real situations rather than the complete resolution that only happened in versions of life that didn't cost anything. By the time Claire left that evening, she had hugged her mother at the door and after a brief pause hugged Nathan too, briefly, without ceremony, the hug of two people with a complicated history who had decided to be on each other's side anyway. He drove home that night with Lily asleep in the back seat, her head tilted to the side in the unguarded way of sleeping children, and thought about all of it. The entire length and weight of the past 7 months, every kitchen conversation and foundation wall and stubborn armchair, every careful admission and difficult telephone call, an evening spent simply sitting at a table with someone who meant what they said. Outside the windows of the truck, the May night was warm for the first time in months, and the trees along the road were fully leafed out and dark against the sky, and the world looked in the ordinary and completely specific way of good nights after difficult seasons, like itself. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Lily's sleeping face. He thought about Victoria in her kitchen garden, notes in the margins of her gardening books, paint on her hands on Saturday mornings, the watercolors lined up along the windowsill of the sitting room where she had started keeping them out rather than putting them away. He thought, this is what different happy looks like. Lily had been right. It was not the same as the other kind. It was its own thing, with its own weight and its own requirements, and it had not arrived easily or without cost, and it was not resolved into something clean and permanent and uncomplicated. But it was real. It was entirely specifically real. And that, Nathan had decided somewhere in the long winter that was now finally behind them, was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. 3 years is enough time for a life to become unrecognizable from the outside while remaining, from the inside, entirely continuous with everything that came before it. Nathan thought about this sometimes, not philosophically, not in the way of someone working through an abstraction, but practically, in the specific way of a person who could remember with complete clarity the October afternoon he had stood on the 4th floor of a half-finished building in Hartford and watched Victoria Ashcroft's name pulse on his phone screen, and who could also look around at his current life and understand that the distance between those 2 points was not a straight line and had not been traveled without cost. It had been traveled anyway. That was the part that mattered. The summer after the May visit with Claire had been, by any honest accounting, the hardest season of the relationship, not because of anything that broke or collapsed, but because of the sustained weight of being a thing that the world had opinions about, and that required, therefore, a continuous expenditure of will to protect. The opinions had arrived in the form such opinions always took, not as confrontation exactly, more as a steady ambient pressure. Board members who looked at Victoria differently in meetings. A profile piece in a regional business journal that had mentioned her personal life in a subordinate clause with the precision of someone who understood that a subordinate clause could carry more weight than a headline. People at Nathan's office who had been told by people who had been told by other people, and who handled the information with the slightly too careful courtesy of colleagues managing something they found surprising. Nathan had developed over those summer months a policy that was less a decision than a temperament. He did not explain, he did not justify, he did not perform normalcy for audiences that had not asked him to. He was with Victoria. That was the fact. The fact did not require his commentary. Victoria had a harder version of the same policy. Her version required her to hold it in boardrooms and shareholder meetings and in the casual social terrain of people who had known her for decades and whose opinions of her had calcified into shapes she was no longer entirely filling. She held it with the same precision she held everything, but Nathan had learned to read the specific quality of her tiredness on the evenings after those days, and he had made it his practice on those evenings to simply show up, not to fix it, not to talk it through, just to be at the kitchen table when she came home, and to have made something for dinner and to stay. Lily helped, in the way that Lily helped most things, by being entirely indifferent to complexity and entirely present to what was in front of her. By the second summer, she had claimed a corner of Victoria's sitting room as her watercolor territory, setting up her own small palette and her own cup of water and her own sheets of paper with the proprietary confidence of a child who had decided a place was hers by virtue of belonging there. Her paintings were abstract in the way of 6-year-olds' paintings, urgent color, no particular adherence to the shapes of actual things. But she was serious about them, and Victoria was serious with her about them. And the two of them in the sitting room on Saturday mornings, bent over their respective papers in the particular silence of people doing something they were attending to fully, had become one of the fixed points of Nathan's week. He had told Lily, in the spring of that second year, in terms she could manage at 6 years old, that Victoria was someone he loved. He had told her sitting at the kitchen table of their own apartment before school on a Tuesday morning, because he believed real conversations happened in ordinary moments rather than prepared ones. Lily had eaten her cereal and thought about it with the focus she brought to problems that required actual consideration. "Like how you love Aunt Diane?" she asked. "Different from that," he said. "Different how?" He had thought about how to say it truthfully in terms a 6-year-old could use. "Like someone you choose," he said. "Someone you wake up in the morning and decide to choose again. Every day." Lily had processed this for a moment, looking at her cereal. Then she looked up at him and said, "Does she choose you back?" "Yes," he said. "She does." Lily had nodded once with the decisiveness she brought to conclusions she was satisfied with. "Okay," she said, and then, "Can we get a dog now?" He had said no, on the grounds that they were not ready for a dog, and Lily had said they had been not ready for a dog for 2 years, and at some point not ready had to become ready, and the conversation had moved on. He had told Victoria about it that evening on the phone, and she had been quiet for a moment and then said, "She accepted it that easily?" "She wanted a dog in exchange," he said. "Obviously," Victoria said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite an emotion Nathan could name, something that sat below the level of laughter and above the level of ordinary warmth. "She's practical. I respect that enormously." "She respects you," Nathan said, "for whatever it's worth coming from me." A pause. "It's worth a great deal," Victoria said quietly. "Coming from you." The dog came the following spring. A medium-sized rescue with significant ears, Lily had maintained her position on the significant ears, named Gerald, who was 4 years old and profoundly calm, and regarded the world with the philosophical acceptance of an animal that had seen difficult things and decided equanimity was the appropriate response. Gerald adapted to both households with a speed that suggested he understood the arrangement better than most humans did, and Lily introduced him to Victoria with the solemnity of someone presenting an important credential. Victoria crouched down to Gerald's level in the entry hall and let him sniff her hand and scratched behind his significant ears and looked up at Lily and said, "He has excellent ears." "I know," Lily said. "I picked him specifically." The board situation arrived in the 3rd year, which was when Nathan had stopped counting months and started experiencing time as a continuous rather than sequential thing. And it arrived in the form that most professional crises arrived in, quietly, through the back, dressed as something else. A faction on Ashcroft Property Group's board, 3 members out of 9, which was a minority but a coordinated one, had been building a case over the preceding 18 months that Victoria's personal life represented a reputational liability for the company. They had not said it in those terms in any formal meeting. They had said it in the terms boards used when they were managing optics rather than strategy. Concerns about leadership perception, questions about executive stability, suggestions that the company's profile would benefit from a period of lower personal visibility for its CEO. Victoria had told Nathan about it in September of the 3rd year, sitting in the kitchen. Where else? On a Sunday evening after Lily had gone home with Rosa and the house was quiet in the particular way of autumn evenings when the year was turning again. She told him without preamble, which was how she told him things she had already decided how to handle. 3 of the board members have been coordinating an informal pressure campaign, she said. They want me to step back from certain public engagements. They've suggested, without saying it directly, that the situation here, you and me, is affecting how institutional partners perceive the company. Nathan looked at her across the table. What are you going to do? I've already done it, she said. I had individual conversations with each of the 3 this week. I told them that I have run this company for 29 years and increased its asset value by a factor of 12, and that my personal life is my personal life, and that if they want to have a formal conversation about leadership transition, they are welcome to bring it to a full board meeting where I can respond formally. She paused. None of them wants a full board meeting. Because they know they'd lose, Nathan said. Because they know they'd lose, she agreed. They don't have the votes and they know it. This was a pressure campaign, not a genuine challenge. Pressure campaigns work on people who are uncertain about what they're defending. She looked at him. I'm not uncertain. He looked at her, at the steadiness in her face, the absolute absence of equivocation, and felt something that was, in its particular character, very close to pride, not because she had defended herself, but because of what she had defended and what she had chosen to be certain about. Good, he said. She looked at the kitchen table. I want you to understand that this will probably not be the last time, she said. The company is large enough that my personal choices will always be subject to this kind of scrutiny. It will happen again in different forms, probably for as long as I'm running the company. I know that, he said, and it doesn't... Victoria. He waited until she met his eyes. I know that. It has not changed anything for me. It will not change anything for me. Do you need me to tell you that more often? Because I can do that. She looked at him for a long moment. You probably should tell me more often, she said, with the self-aware dryness that was one of his favorite things about her. I'm apparently susceptible to needing to hear it even when I already know it. That's called being a person, he said. It's very inconvenient, she said. I know, he said. Welcome. She made a sound that was fully a laugh, the real one, the unmanaged one. And he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand and held his, and outside the kitchen windows the September evening was darkening slowly, and the kitchen garden was in its late-season fullness. Everything it had been building toward all spring and summer present and heavy, and about to begin its annual return to the structural bones of itself. He thought, sitting there, about the first time he had seen that garden. Winter bare, frost-covered, dormant. About the way Victoria had said, I have always been better at building things than inhabiting them. About how that had been true then and was less true now, and how the distance between those 2 points was a thing she had built herself, without blueprint, without the certainty she usually required before committing to a project. Some things you built by living in them. He had not known that, fully, before the last 3 years. He knew it now. He proposed on a Saturday evening in October, 3 years and approximately 1 week after the first phone call, in the dining room they had never quite successfully rearranged for the holiday reception because the armchair had been first. It was not planned the way proposals in movies were planned. There was no reservation, no ring box concealed in a dessert, no audience arranged to witness the moment. It was a Saturday evening after dinner they had made together, a joint production that had involved a genuine disagreement about whether the pasta needed more salt, which Victoria had won, correctly. And Lily had been there for dinner and had fallen asleep on the sitting room couch at 8:30 with Gerald arranged along the back of her knees, and they had left her sleeping and come back to the dining room with the last of the wine. The dining room was the room where the armchair had lived before they moved it to the drawing room 3 years ago. It had the long table and the chairs and the photographs on the walls and the particular quality of evenings spent in it, dinner parties and working lunches, and one memorable Sunday when Claire had come with her boyfriend of 7 months, a quiet landscape architect from New Haven named David, who had looked at the house with the attentiveness of someone who loved old things. And Victoria had watched her daughter laugh at something David said, and had caught Nathan's eye across the table with an expression that was too full to have a name. The dining room had become, without anyone deciding it should, the room where things happened, where conversations were finished and decisions were made and the ordinary substance of a life shared was conducted. Nathan set his wine glass down and looked at Victoria across the table, at the silver in her hair that had been there when he met her and had become, over 3 years, entirely inseparable from how he understood her face, at the slight paint stain on the heel of her left hand that she was perpetually unable to completely wash off, at the particular quality of her attention when she was relaxed, which was different from her professional attention in a way that he could now read precisely and that he valued more than he had ever told her adequately. I want to marry you, he said. She looked at him. Not startled, he thought, watching her face, that she was not startled, that somewhere below the surface she had known this was coming. In the formless way you knew things that were true before they were stated, but present, fully present to the moment, not managed, not deflecting into practicality. Nathan, she said. I know we haven't talked about it directly, he said. I know there are things we'd need to figure out, Practically. The house, Lily's school, all of it. I know it's not simple. He paused. I also know that I have sat at this table and every other table in this house for 3 years, and every time I'm here I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. And every time I leave I'm already thinking about coming back. And I'm done treating that like a condition I manage. It's what I want. You're what I want. She was looking at him with those unguarded eyes, the ones he had learned to wait for, the ones that appeared when the composure was not performing anything, just present, just hers. I am 58 years old, she said. Yes, he said, I'm aware. You are 36. Also aware. People will, Victoria, he said gently. We had this conversation 3 years ago, in this house, at a different table. He held her eyes. I know what people will say. I have known for 3 years. It has not changed anything. It will not change anything. She was quiet for a long moment. He let the silence be what it was. He had learned, over 3 years, when to hold and when to wait, and this was a moment for waiting, for letting her arrive at her own answer in her own time without the pressure of his need for it. She looked at the table, at her wine glass, at the window where the October night was outside, dark and still. He watched her face move through several things he recognized. The old reflex toward management, toward weighing, toward the careful modeling of outcomes before commitment. He watched it move through those things and come out the other side. She looked at him. I have painted that garden in every season, she said. I have 14 paintings of it now. They're in the sitting room, stacked against the wall in the order I made them. She paused. The winter ones are the most technically careful. The summer ones are the most alive. The autumn ones are the most honest. She stopped. I couldn't paint them at all 4 years ago. I had forgotten how to make something with no practical application. You reminded me that I knew how. You reminded yourself, he said. I just told you to. Don't minimize it, she said, with a sharpness that was entirely affectionate. You showed up repeatedly in a year when I had organized my life so that nothing showed up unexpectedly. You showed up and stayed and didn't require anything from me except that I be honest. That is not a small thing. That is not something you do by accident or by... She stopped. Her voice was not unsteady exactly, but it had something in it that was the precursor to unsteady, and she was choosing, he could see, not to manage it. I'm better at my work because of you. I sleep more. I have plants in the kitchen garden that I grew from seed and that I am unreasonably proud of. My daughter comes to this house and laughs at dinner. I paint on Saturday mornings and my hands are always slightly stained, and I have stopped caring about that. She looked at him steadily. You did not do those things to me or for me, but you were here while I did them, and that matters, and I need you to know that I know that. He looked at her across the table and felt the full weight of 3 years and the particular quality of being truly known, not idealized, not managed, not the simplified version of himself that was easier to present, but known, specifically and accurately and without revision. Is that a yes? He said. She looked at him. Something that was not quite a smile, and was better than a smile, moved through her face. Yes, she said. It is. He did not have a ring. He had thought about that in the preceding weeks, and had decided, correctly, he was now certain, that Victoria Ashcroft was not a woman for whom the ring was the point. The point was the question and the answer and what they meant. The ring would come later, chosen together, which was the correct way for it to happen. He reached across the table and took both her hands, and she held his, and the dining room was quiet around them with the October night outside and Lily asleep in the sitting room and Gerald's slow breathing audible from down the hall. And the house held them in the way old houses held things they had witnessed, solidly, without comment, with the authority of something that had been here long enough to understand that the significant moments were almost always ordinary. They sat there for a while without needing to say anything. That, Nathan had come to believe, was one of the true measures of a relationship. Not the quality of its conversations, but the quality of its silences. Whether the silences were comfortable or anxious, inhabited or empty, full of the presence of the other person, or haunted by the absence of one. This silence was full, completely full. There was nothing missing from it. Lily woke up on the sitting room couch at 9:15, disoriented from the unplanned sleep, and came into the dining room with her hair pressed flat on one side and Gerald trailing behind her, and looked at the two of them sitting at the table with their hands together and assessed the situation with the particular accuracy of a child who had been paying close attention for 3 years. "What happened?" she said. Nathan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Nathan. "We're going to get married," Nathan said. Lily stood in the doorway of the dining room for a moment, processing this with the focused seriousness she brought to significant information. Then she looked at Victoria. "Are you going to live with us?" "We'll figure that out together," Victoria said. "All of us." Lily considered this. She looked around the dining room, at the long table and the photographs on the walls and the window and the kitchen beyond, with the expression of someone taking inventory of something they have already decided they want. Then she looked at Gerald, who had sat down beside her with the philosophical placidity that was his defining characteristic. "Gerald likes it here," Lily said. "He always settles better here than at home." "Gerald has excellent judgment," Victoria said. Lily looked at her father. "Can we have a garden at our house? Like Victoria's?" "We live in an apartment," Nathan said. "Then we should not live in an apartment," Lily said, with the simple logic of a child for whom the conclusion was obvious. She looked at Victoria. "You have a lot of room." "I do," Victoria agreed. "So that's the answer," Lily said. Nathan looked at his daughter, this specific, serious, entirely her own person who had been asking him for 2 years whether he was the other kind of happy, and who had recognized, before he had admitted it to himself, that happy and the other kind of happy were not the same, and both were necessary, and neither one replaced the other, and felt the full accumulated weight of every good thing that had happened in the last 3 years press against the back of his chest and stay there, warm and permanent and entirely real. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is." They moved in the following summer, which involved more logistical complexity than any of them had prepared for, and which proceeded with a level of organizational chaos that Victoria found genuinely distressing and Lily found genuinely exciting, and Nathan navigated between the two extremes with the patience of a structural engineer who understood that transitions under load required flexibility rather than rigidity. Lily's room was in the east wing, which had not been used as a bedroom since Victoria's children had grown up in it, and she chose it because of the light. The east windows caught the morning first, which suited her because she was, as Nathan had told Victoria in the first months, a person who woke up with complete engagement and required no ramp-up period. Lily had also claimed the corner of the sitting room where the watercolors lived as a shared territory, and had begun the quiet process of populating the house with the specific evidence of her existence: drawings on the refrigerator, books on the end table, one of Gerald's tennis balls perpetually under some piece of furniture. The house received all of it without objection. Old houses were good at receiving. They had the capacity of things that had held many lives and understood that each one left marks, and that the marks were the point, not a problem to be corrected. Claire came to dinner in the first week of August. Claire and David both, David, who had become a fixture in the Ashcroft Gravity over the preceding year, who was quiet and observant and who had said to Nathan once, over drinks while the women talked, "She seems lighter than she was." "Victoria, whatever you're doing, don't stop." Nathan had not known what to say to that, except thank you, and David had nodded once and they had not talked about it again, which was the correct outcome. That dinner at the long table in the dining room was the first one in which all of them were present simultaneously in a configuration that felt not finished, because lives were not finished, but settled into something that had accepted its own shape. Claire and Victoria moving through the kitchen with the specific ease of a mother and daughter who had done the work of relearning each other. David and Nathan at the dining table with their respective drinks, talking about a bridge project Nathan was working on in Vermont. The kind of conversation that happened between men who had found they occupied the same orbit and were comfortable there. Lily at the counter eating an olive directly out of the jar, which no one had the energy to address, and Gerald under the table waiting with his particular brand of philosophical patience for something edible to fall. Victoria stood at the kitchen window for a moment, not doing anything, not attending to anything, just standing and looking out at the summer garden that was in its full August abundance Everything she had planted in April and May and June, present and alive. The raised beds crowded and specific, the border flowers going in the warm evening air. Nathan came and stood beside her. "The tomatoes are behind," she said. "They'll catch up," he said. "They won't be ready before the first frost." "Some of them will," he said. "And the ones that aren't, that's next year's information." She looked at the garden for a moment, then at him. "You're very relaxed about things that don't meet their projections. Some things you can't force into schedule," he said. "You can only set up the right conditions and let them go." She looked at him with the expression he had catalogued over 3 years, the one that meant she understood he was not talking about tomatoes and that she was deciding whether to call him on it. She decided not to. Instead, she leaned slightly against him, her shoulder against his arm, and looked back at the garden. Behind them in the kitchen, Claire laughed at something David said, a genuine laugh, unguarded and warm. Lily said something that made everyone laugh, though Nathan missed the words. Gerald made the small sound he made when he was dreaming. The summer evening held the house in its particular amber light, and the garden was alive outside the window, and the old house was full. Not with performance or management or the careful maintenance of surfaces, but with actual people doing actual things and occasionally getting in each other's way and figuring it out anyway. Victoria had painted this house in every winter configuration and every dormant state. She had painted it under gray January light and under the flat white of February and under the first tentative March sun. She had painted it well, and she had painted it badly, and she had thrown away 4 paintings that she genuinely disliked and kept 2 that she genuinely loved and hung them in the upstairs hallway where she saw them every morning. She had not yet painted it like this, full in summer and inhabited by people who had chosen to be here. She was already seeing where the light fell on the garden in a way she would need to remember, the specific amber of this hour on these particular plants, the way the tomato cages cast long shadows across the bed, and the late sunflowers stood above everything else with the particular self-satisfaction of things that had grown as tall as they intended. She would paint it. Not tonight. Tonight was for this, for being in it rather than rendering it. But soon. Nathan knew she was looking at it in that way. He knew, because he knew her, that the painting was already beginning in some interior space while she stood here being present to the actual evening. He did not say anything about it. He had learned when things were better observed than commented on. He looked at the garden, too, and thought, as he had thought on a cold drive home in December 3 years ago and many times since, about what it meant to build a life rather than plan one. About the difference between the structure you designed in advance and the one that grew from the materials available, less controlled, less certain, more alive. About the old house around them that had stood for 130 years because someone in 1891 had known which stones to set and how deep to set them and how much weight they could bear, and had been right, and everything built on top of that foundation had the luxury of being temporary and alive and changeable because the thing underneath was solid. That was all a foundation ever did, finally. It did not make things easy. It did not prevent the cracked plaster or the failed window cord or the seasonal rot at the margins. It simply made things possible. It held long enough for everything above it to happen. He thought about an armchair in a doorway, about laughing with the woman he had not yet known over something entirely stupid and mundane, and the way her face had looked in that moment, the composure gone, and the person underneath visible and warm and entirely herself for 30 seconds before it all reassembled. He had known, he thought, in some not quite conscious way, even then, not what it was, but that it was something, that the 30 seconds mattered. The world was full of people who never gave themselves the 30 seconds, who organized their lives so thoroughly around safety and predictability and the careful modeling of outcomes that the unexpected moments had no room to mean anything before they were filed away and sealed off. He had been one of those people. He recognized the instinct because it was still there, still present in him, still his default inclination when something arrived without preparation. The calculation ran automatically. What is the risk? What is the cost? What is the exposure? The calculation was not wrong. Risk was real. Cost was real. Exposure, the specific vulnerability of wanting something fully and being seen to want it, was as real as any physical weight he had ever borne. But the calculation was not the whole story. The calculation could tell you the load. It could not tell you whether the building was worth it. You had to decide that yourself. And then you had to set the foundation. He had set it in the only way that ever worked, by showing up, by coming back, by sitting at the table and meaning what he said and staying when it was inconvenient and being honest when honesty cost something, by treating the person across from him as a person rather than a configuration of risks to be managed. She had done the same. That was the part that did not have a name and did not need one. She had looked at everything between them, the age and the history and the complications and the public weight of her own life. And she had chosen him anyway, not once but continuously, every time the calculation could have gone the other way. That was what love was, finally, when you stripped away everything that it wasn't. Not the feeling, which came and went and could not be relied upon in any structural sense, but the choice. The repeated, deliberate, costly choice to keep building towards something with another person, even on the days when the foundation felt uncertain and the weather was wrong and the margins showed signs of rot. You fixed the rot and you kept going. Outside the kitchen window, the summer garden held its abundance in the amber evening light. The tomatoes that were behind schedule leaned on their cages with the patient determination of things that would get there when they got there and not before. The sunflowers stood at their full, improbable height. The border flowers moved in the evening air that had finally, after a day of August heat, found its way to something gentle. Victoria was still leaning slightly against him, her shoulder warm through the fabric of his shirt, her eyes on the garden, and behind them in the rooms of the old house. The people they loved most in the world were talking and laughing and dropping olives on the floor for Gerald, and existing in the comfortable, imperfect way of people who had figured out, not easily, not without cost, but finally and truly, that they were supposed to be here. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Dad," she said, "Claire says we can make dessert. Can I be in charge?" "Being in charge means doing the work," Nathan said. "I know that," Lily said, with the patience of someone who had been told this before and found it obvious. She looked at Victoria. "Will you help?" Victoria pushed off from the counter and turned around and looked at Nathan's daughter. This small, complete, entire person with the significant-eared dog and the watercolors in the sitting room and the room in the east wing that she had already filled with the particular evidence of herself. And something in Victoria's face was entirely unmanaged, entirely open, entirely without the careful composure she had spent decades constructing, and 3 years learning she did not always need. "Yes," she said. "I'll help." Lily went back to the kitchen. Victoria looked at Nathan for a moment. Just a moment. The specific look of two people who have been through enough together to communicate in the economy of a glance, and then followed. Nathan stayed at the window another minute, looking at the garden in the last of the amber light, listening to the voices in the kitchen behind him. Claire and Victoria and Lily layered over each other, instructions and laughter and the particular noise of people making something together, and thought, this is it. This is the thing you build a life toward without knowing you're building toward it. Not perfect, not without its fractures and its repairs and its seasonal rot at the margins, not without the mornings when the weight of everything felt more than either of them had calculated for, or the evenings when the complications of their particular situation arrived again in forms that required sitting down and deciding, again, that this was what they were choosing. All of that was true, and none of it changed the essential fact, which was that a life was happening here, a real one, with real people in it, built on something that had been tested by the weight it had been asked to carry, and had held. That was all you could ask of any foundation. He turned from the window and walked toward the kitchen, toward the voices and the warmth and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of everyone he loved being in the same room on a summer evening, choosing to stay.